The nation of one. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, there is a country you have never heard of. It has a flag, a currency, a constitution, and a head of state. It has citizens. Well, technically one. And that citizen is also its founder, its president, its army, and its only taxpayer. His name was Lazarus Long, or at least that's what he called himself. He wasn't crazy. That's the thing everyone who ever met him says first, almost defensively, as if they need to get it out of the way before anything else makes sense. He was methodical, clear-eyed, legally literate in ways that made trained lawyers uncomfortable, which is exactly what made him dangerous. This story starts not with rebellion, but with debt. It was the late 1980s. The IRS had new tools, new reach, new teeth. For a certain kind of man, the kind who had made money in ways that didn't bear too much scrutiny, the walls were closing in. And some of those men started asking a question that sounds, on the surface, completely insane. What if I built my own country? There is a document called the Montevideo Convention, signed in 1933. It lays out, in plain language, what it actually takes to be a country. You need a permanent population, a defined territory, a functioning government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. That's it. 4 things. No minimum population, no size requirement, no clause saying the world has to like you. Our man read that document very carefully, and then he read it again. His real name was Bruce Douglas Gaines, born 1951. Tucson, Arizona. Father was an electrician. Mother worked at a grocery store. By every measure of his early life, he was unremarkable. Simply a man who was very good at convincing other people of things. He sold insurance in his 20s, then real estate, then something that was technically real estate but closer to a Ponzi scheme. By the mid-1980s, he had made somewhere between $2 and $4 million. The IRS was counting all of them. By 1989, the number the government wanted had grown to $1.3 million. That's not a number that ruins you. That's a number that redefines you. A man with a case number. A man with a court date. Unless he'd been reading the way desperate people read, searching for the one sentence that saves them. He found the sovereign citizen movement. Most of those people ended up in prison. But buried deeper was something different. Something that didn't argue against the system. Something that tried to step entirely outside of it. Micronations. In 1967, a former British Army major named Paddy Roy Bates claimed a rusting sea fort 7 miles off the coast of England and declared it the sovereign nation of Sealand. It had a constitution, stamps, a national anthem. It survived an actual coup attempt against a sea fort. Bruce Gaines read about Sealand and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And immediately behind that hope, a more dangerous thought. Sealand was improvised, built on nerve rather than legal architecture. What if someone did this properly? He researched maritime law for months. He studied contested waters, uninhabited formations, legal ambiguity. And then he found it, a stretch of reef in the South Pacific, barely above sea level at high tide, sitting in genuinely contested waters where a creative legal argument might have room to breathe. He flew out to see it. It was roughly the size of a basketball court at low tide, covered in bird droppings, no fresh water, no shade, almost completely inhospitable to human life. He declared it a nation. The Republic of Lostaria was formally established on September 14th, 1990. The founding documents ran to 47 pages. He gave himself the title of President for Life, which is, in fairness, never a great sign. He designed a flag, blue and gold, a stylized wave, and had it printed at a sign shop whose owner thought he was making a boat banner. Then he started selling passports, $2,000 each, through libertarian newsletters and anti-government forums circulating in the pre-internet underground. Between 30 and 60 people bought them, and they weren't criminals. They were a retired schoolteacher in Oregon, a software engineer in Texas, a dairy farmer in Vermont who had never been in trouble with the law in his life. People who felt the country had stopped being theirs. The passport wasn't a travel document, it was a statement. But passports were never the plan. They were seed money. What Lazarus Long actually needed was recognition from governments. He began writing official letters on Republic of Lostaria, letterhead to small nations across the Pacific and Caribbean. Proposals for diplomatic relations, trade agreements, mutual recognition treaties. Most nations ignored him, but a few responded. One small Pacific nation sent back a letter acknowledging his proposal and expressing openness to further dialogue. Probably a form letter. It was not recognition. But Lazarus Long had it framed. Put it on the wall of his apartment in Honolulu, and according to the woman who cleaned that apartment, he looked at it every single day. By 1992, the IRS had found him. Not through anything dramatic, just traces. The kind a man leaves when he is spending money and flying internationally and printing official government letterhead. He was served with a formal summons in a grocery store. Between the cereal aisle and the frozen foods, he looked at the summons, looked at the agent, and reached into his jacket and produced his Lostarian passport. The agent stood there, then said, "Sir, you were born in Tucson." And Bruce Gaines said very calmly, "That is a matter my government disputes." What followed was a legal battle lasting almost 4 years. His defense rested on 3 claims: that his renunciation of U.S. citizenship was legally valid, that Lostaria met every criterion of the Montevideo Convention, and that the U.S. government, by prosecuting him, was committing an act of aggression against a sovereign nation. He brought in the 47-page Constitution, the framed diplomatic letter, affidavits from his passport holders, his citizens, attesting to Lostaria as a functioning state. Federal District Court Judge Sandra Okamoto listened to all of it and gave him more latitude than most judges would have. Her ruling ran to 61 pages. Guilty on all counts. 32 months in federal prison. But buried in those 61 pages was something no one had anticipated. She wrote, "The court does not doubt the sincerity of the defendant's belief in Lostaria's existence. What the court is required to hold is simply this: sincerity is not sovereignty. A nation requires more than documents. It requires the willingness of others to see what you see." She wrote that to convict him, to close the argument, to draw the line between what is legally real and what is legally imaginary. But Bruce Gaines, reading it in his cell, read it differently. He read it as a to-do list. He served 22 months, released in 1997, 46 years old, the debt still growing daily in a government database somewhere. Most people would be finished. He went back to a small apartment in Albuquerque and updated the Lostarian Constitution. He wrote a memoir, self-published, Sovereign, the true story of the world's smallest republic. It sold around 1,000 copies, several of them to law schools, which assigned it not as precedent, but as a case study in what happens when a human being simply refuses to accept the world's verdict on what is possible. Then in 2003, something happened that none of his critics had accounted for. The internet arrived, fully, broadly, into the hands of everyone who had ever believed something the world had officially declared untrue. A website appeared, lostaria.gov, not .com, not .org, .gov. It had a coat of arms, passport applications, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At its peak, 40,000 unique visitors a month. The US government seized the domain. He migrated. The community followed. People in 11 countries who called themselves Lostarian citizens, exchanging ideas, a fellowship built entirely around a shared, impractical dream. And then there was the reef. In 2001, before the website, but its weight arrives here. A storm moved through the South Pacific. Not headline news, but in the specific geography of one contested coral formation, it was definitive. The reef submerged. At standard tide, there was nothing there, just ocean. The Pacific, as indifferent to human paperwork as it has always been. Bruce Gaines said nothing publicly. The website made no mention of it. He simply continued, as if the territory still existed, as if the land beneath his claim was still breaking the surface somewhere out there in the blue. The last confirmed interview with Bruce Gaines was given in 2019. He was 68 years old, living in a small town in southern New Mexico. He sounded older, quieter. The evangelical certainty of his younger years had become something more like stillness. The interviewer asked him, "Was it worth it?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I built a country, out of nothing, out of documents and belief and sheer refusal to accept that the world had already decided what was possible. It didn't survive, but it existed. It was real to me, and it was real to the people who believed in it. They can take your documents. They can take your reef. They can take your name. They cannot take what you built in your own mind." Bruce Douglas Gaines died in February of 2022 in a hospital in Las Cruces, New Mexico. He was 70 years old, heart failure. His obituary described him as a man who believed, with total and sometimes catastrophic sincerity, that the world was more flexible than it wanted you to think. The IRS debt, compounding for over 30 years, was listed as an outstanding obligation of his estate. The estate contained approximately $11,000, 34 unsold copies of his memoir, and the furniture in a rented house. The Republic of Lostaria's website is still up, last updated 3 weeks after his death. A single line: "The president is dead. Lostaria endures." There is a reef somewhere in the South Pacific. At the lowest tides, on the right day, a few square feet of coral break the surface. There is nothing on it. But somewhere in a drawer, in 11 countries, there is a blue passport, gold lettering, a name inside. The name of a country that exists only because one man from Tucson decided that it did. The judge said sovereignty requires the willingness of others to see what you see. You know this country's name now. You can picture its flag. You know what it cost him. If that's not the willingness of others to see what he saw, what is?